part. So we get submittals, and I would say most all of the time the compost is very green. And you can see the CN ratio, you know, the report tells you what it is, you know, and a lot of numbers that I don't know how to analyze, but you can see that the nitrogen, you know, it's green, and our specs call for mature compost, and it just seems to me that we have a soil that is low in nitrogen, and, you know, I'll call up soil plant lab, and they say, well, that's okay, it'll balance out. However, in balancing out, won't it be taking nitrogen from your already nitrogen deficient soil?
Anybody want that?
Depends on what's organic, what you have in the soil now, how much organic is in the soil now.
Usually it's pretty low.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's import topsoil, you know, it's usually sandy low, but, you know, import topsoil, and it says right there in the analysis that's low nitrogen. And then we have this compost that's pretty green. It just seems like I shouldn't be putting this in the soil.
So the question basically is, how do you read the analysis sheet that you get from the lab?
I guess my question is it okay to put green compost
Or should
in
you
nitrogen
neutralize it?
loads?
Or should you nitralize it and soup it up some more?
Or should we just reject it and get it ready?
Okay, so a number of issues might come up. You want it? You're the yard guy. So.
Are you having trouble reading the report?
No.
No.
She doesn't like what
And
she's reading.
When you say green, what does it mean by green?
Am I being too pictures?
Young, I think it's not.
It's not finished.
So it's not mature.
Yeah.
Got it. Much of the compost does not have time to cure, to mature. It is active. I'm running into that problem a lot. Where I am, the demand is high. So the compost process is 3 to 4 months. Ideally, that should be on the ground another 3 to 4 months to fully mature, to be really ready. But that would be in a perfect world. So I don't know the answer other than as we get more material, we'll be able to have it longer. What other questions were there?
Well, will it mature in situ?
In what?
Will it mature in situ?
Sure.
Right?
Put on
It's
green.
gonna rob the
Is it
soil of
gonna-
nitrogen.
She's asking
Wow,
will it
that's-
rob the
Yeah,
soil or will it mature itself?
Unmature amendments, in my experience, have yes, robbed nitrogen. I don't think compost does the same thing. Maybe other people can answer that.
Sure.
I do think that's something that you are right to be concerned about. So you want to be paying close attention to the C/N ratio relative to your own soil. In a composting facility for that last maturing phase, they would just pile it up in a windrow for that to let it cure and mature, and then that C/N ratio would continue to change. So I think you could leave it in situ would be my impression, but I would definitely try to get the mature best compost. I think you're making the right choice. You definitely don't want to be losing the nitrogen that you need for your plants.
There's a lot of unhappy places. Yes.
I do.
I told that.
Are you saying there's a lot of unhappy places with the material you're using?
No faces.
Oh, because you rejected. Well, okay. Now,
I didn't get to the site yet, it's fine.
I admit that my sites are worse, but because of that, we do more deconstruction of what's going on. And so I've got 3 items that pertain to this that may or may not pass muster with the experts or you as experienced people. But the first thing is, we have been very careful to use mature versus cured terms. And when it passes 503 regs for a nuisance reduction, it is then mature, but it's green in a way, and so we say, no, we want it to be cured, which is the holding it in a pile until it doesn't reheat as much or at all. So I'm going to throw that out for people to use, because that's helped me winnow through that process that you're talking about. Mature, 503, it's legal to sell, but it's not really what you want biologically. So,
Accurate.
I'll put that out. Second thing is, if you look at your end load, and I have seen some organics suck in out of the soil in the decomposition, but I think you really have to have a very low soil. If it's anything that looks like a soil, I'm going to say that probably doesn't happen on a mass balance ratio, because you've got enough in already in your soil or coming in from the atmosphere if you're in the Bay Area. And the one exception is if you put on a lot of straw and a lot of really coarse organics on strawberries, I've seen them go yellow. But for any less productive plant than a vibrant veg crop with no previous organic amendment from last year, successively years previously, I'm going to bet that if we did the end balance, you wouldn't see a threatening end drawdown for a couple of reasons. So I don't think that's the first issue. The next thing that we've done with yard waste compost from around the bay is if you screen them, the finer you screen them, the more mature they act. And what we try and do is we try and go the other way. We want to rob in out of all available places to slow down weed growth on our unmanaged, I'm in wildlands, I'm not a horticultural guy. We're talking about pasture ground, forestry areas, road edges, mines, so by choking down the weed growth, we get our perennial grasses and forbs a little more time, a year and a half or two, to start growing. So we ask for unscreened yard waste compost with all the wood in there to reduce that end release a little more. Conversely, if you go to 3/8, if you go to 1/4 inch, you get a finer and finer product, and if you look at it spectrophotographically, this thing looks like a mature compost, even though it's, what do they call it, green, immature. It's amazing. Because what you're doing is you're just taking all the fractions that are already processed. So you've got a little bit of wiggle room. Go tell your producer to give you whatever you want.
So my experience, I've worked with a couple of the urban farms in San Francisco and Berkeley, and I was once working a couple years back, and we got a load of green compost, and it smelled bad, and we just completely didn't use it. We just had to get a completely new load, and it had to be really mature, because especially if you're using it on like a community farm. But the question is, Kelly mentioned Omri and the compost council and stuff. Are there people out there who are inspecting the stuff so that when you order this, I don't know what the status is right now. So when you say, if I want, it has to be cured, it has to be mature, that's what I need, that's what I want. Can you get stuff which is certified? What's the status of what's going on there?
What is going on is that much of the compost is coming from the municipalities themselves. And they are inundated with a lot more than they can handle. And the quality is really not up to par right now. Maybe across the board. Like I said, this is really an infant. This whole process just started. Yes, compost can be Omri listed. They have obviously a strict protocol. There is the U.S. Compost Council's seal of testing approval. STA is something you'll be hearing about. STA is a process by which we test the compost. Is there a compost police? No. That actually, well, yeah, there is. The LEA from the state of California visits the compost facilities on a regular basis. There are some systems set up. The large municipalities are having to deal with contamination issues on a large scale. It's a challenge, and I can't wait for 10 years from now. I really can't. When this is sunk in and the processes have been in place. I think U.S. Compost Council is doing a great job by implementing their STA. Omri does not ask, for material to be listed. We have to ask them, and I think it's been great. Everybody knows Omri, and it's a starting point.
The Soil Control Lab has a hot or green test that they can do that'll give you that excessive respiration, that green read.
There are definitely indicators. Your comment, I feel like we should reevaluate the lab report. I feel like the lab report needs to be redone.
Because I have to say.
I mean, in a more, applicable, way, so that we know maybe what this is good for.
Yeah.
Not that, you have to dissect the lab report and go through all these numbers and scales and, I mean, it's
I think that you always get sampled, like a bag of it, and it's always dark, and it doesn't smell. And it's usually, like a show, like completely immature to mature. It's never more than middle. And then the ones that are pretty low in maturity, those are the ones that I reject. But in terms of just looking at it visually, it looks right. It doesn't look like they're sitting improperly.
It looks great.
Yeah.
The bad smell is an anaerobic smell, an anaerobic process. It did not go through the right process. And there, like I said, there are so many different types of compost, and unfortunately, we just have to, try to seek out what is going to work best for you, and what compost is right.
Couple thoughts. One is the Soil Plant Lab gives you a report, and also have a written recommendation of what to do. I mean, we're not in a position really to rethink the science, so we kind of go by the recommendations. That's why I like your comment about the report. But secondly, it's not always a structural issue. A lot of times it's like alignment. The pH is way off. And do you have any solutions for dealing with pH of 11 or 12?
I've never seen it that high.
That's your soil, or is that the compost?
Oh,
No, the soil.
okay.
And so what do we, dig it all out and throw it away, or can we, what can we do there?
Anybody? pH?
That's compost.
Juggling?
Okay, so first, I'm going to say that by adding, compost has some acidity to it, like pine needles, but it's a small amount compared to a soil profile that's got the wrong pH. So I'm going to make a statement that you're not going to correct your soil pH using organics. They're great for a lot of other things, but they're not a chemical liming agent. Second thing is, let's well, I don't want to get into the weeds, but we have to deconstruct what those pHs really are, because there's kind of set points. Anytime you're over 8 or 8.3, there's lime in there from somewhere, an old lime factory or something. By the time you get over 9.5, then you've got sodium, black sodium hydroxyl sites. It's like it's some bay gunk. You find this in the deserts. I've never seen it here.
Oakland,
Huh?
You find it downtown Oakland, you find it in Fremont, you find it...
11?
Yes, it's beyond building because they've limed it, basically, during construction. They pour lime all over the site. So then you're left...
Well, okay, you know what? They've done more than carbonate lime. Then they stabilized it with a calcium oxide or hydroxide. Yeah, well, that's... Okay, so then the next thing is, when you have things that are that weird, and this happens on the acid side too, I usually do more acid mines, you have to ask two questions. One is, what's the pH, and yours are high, and I can see why that would be if they stabilized it with those oxides. But then the next question is, no matter what the pH is, then there's a separate issue of how much acidity you have to put on to get it down. If I give you a thimbleful of that calcium oxide or hydroxide that they use to stabilize. I mean, there's a whole industry of soil stabilization. If I give you a thimbleful of that stuff, it's not going to take much acidity to reduce that. But if you got 3 feet, or it's a built-up pad, or it's a half acre, you're talking about a lot of acidity to bring that down. And in that case, I'd say, sounds like a financial undoable situation, and I'd seal it off or bury it and put on 3 feet of grow whatever above it, just because of the amount of I mean, you're talking not train loads, but certainly many semi-loads of acid to drop that down at that point. And because they did a good job of alkalinizing it and dispersing the soil and making it a
So I shouldn't
good.
feel guilty about excavating it then. No other solution.
Yeah, I mean, is it landfill? Is that where it's going to go?
No, it's really just, you know,
It's a little
foundation
strip?
planting around buildings. or something.
They're making building pads.
Yeah.
I mean,
So it's
typically,
not far
you have a
beyond.
No,
project,
it's like
it's
5 feet
Christmas
out.
time, it's raining, the show must go on, and they say, we're gonna line treat so we can get in there.
Right.
Oh,
And it
is that what it
it's critical when this comes to the table, is to have them delineate exactly where they're gonna do that. And you have to draw a line that they cannot, you can't let them go beyond that. I mean, because they got those big machines, they wanna turn it around. Next thing, you're gonna have it's all concrete. And that stuff, it will also migrate. So if you can't just excavate away, and if you put the nice soil up next to it, those roots will get in there, they'll start to suck that lime out, that'll suck it right up into the leaf structure, and now you got a little concrete plant. It dies. They die, and it takes about 3 or 4 years, and you'll wonder why the plants are all dying. It's because those roots are going down next, so you have to not only hog it out, but then put a water barrier in there, so it won't migrate. And then trying to treat it, they'll tell you can treat it with oxygen and water and leach it out, and I've seen more stuff die from it than survive. And so it's just a matter of controlling the necessity.
So what do you do in that 5 feet then?
Go to the grassland.
Put a rock mulch in.
Yeah,
do something else.
They're making it a no-fly zone so that they can put in their parking lot. I mean,
Yeah.
the worst is they do the parking lot, and then you got a tree planter right in the middle of it, and you're expecting to dig a hole surrounded what's toxic to a plant, and so it's just a matter of the contractors that they all want to keep the machine going, and that's a tool that uses them, it assists
In
them.
their defense, sometimes it's a contractor, sometimes it was a contractor 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Sure, sure. Yeah, it's and luckily we don't get that much weather in this region, and if you can stay the fight for about 3 months, the rain goes away and everything's okay again. But it's also a matter of documenting that as they go in to explain to your client what, in order to keep their schedule at hand, what the potential pitfalls are going to be down the road.
Well, look at the cost trade-off. I mean, it's cost trade-off to accelerate the schedule and lime treat, but what's the cost trade-off to haul that stuff back out now and bring in new soil? Nobody's doing that analysis when they're planning this.
Yeah, those decisions are normally made, in haste. One of the interesting things too is reading the reports and the soil reports, and what in deciphering what, when the lab gets that composite soil sample from the site, and they'll take that and they pulverize it and they take out the gravels and they put those to the side, and then they'll break it up and they'll do their test to find out if the toxins are in there, and the clay and the sand and the silt, and you'll understand that, and they give you this percolation rate that's on this, from this, it's not what that soil was anymore that they're testing, and it's not really in the condition that when you get the test report and you see that it perks at 1 inch per hour, and you're like, oh, it's just cleared the mark, but that's when they're in the lab, they're testing that percolation just at like about 70 to 75%, and that's after they've pulverized it and mashed it up and taken the gravel out. And so you're not, it's just a matter of understanding that report isn't, you have to take it with a grain of salt in what you're interpreting.
And I think it's also important to get into these discussions early in the project in schematic design, because that's when your contractor will be proposing one treatment. And I've been in on meetings where the architect, nobody understands her implications. And it has to be the landscape architect who says, no, you can't do it. Or you can't do it past this zone, because otherwise nobody really understands what happens.
Conard, can you talk more about this kind of educating this soil testing labs and what we need? And it's just as you say, it's not necessarily useful information, and sometimes it's.
Well, that was part of the question too, about how to read the results. The lab says.
So in this
Puts the
situation
compost
that
in,
you just
good.
described,
Yeah.
okay, so it's not really representing what's out there. So then, what do you do?
Well, this is, you got to ask the lab the right question about what when you're conditioning. You take the raw sample of this material, and they'll take that and they pulverize it down. And they look at how it can work, and they'll give you a standard answer most of the time about 10 yards of compost and some fertilizer, and you're good to go. But they're not talking about soil structure. They're not talking about the profile that you're working with. If you're dealing with topsoil and subsoil that you're trying to create, and so if you can share your specification with the lab and talk to them about what system you're developing, and have them gear their response towards your desired outcome, they'll give you a different report than that standard, I mean, if you can look at all the reports, and it's pretty standard. They have they just kind of plug in their report thing. They're doing what they do, but you need to tailor it. You talk to them, send them your spec, tell them what you want it to do, what percentages, what you're asking them to do. Because typically the contractors, they're just putting it in a bag, they send it off for the test, and then they're putting that through the submittal, and you're seeing that. And so there's just a dialogue that needs to happen with the lab, so that they're conducting the tests to help you get what you want it to be.
In the soil side, we split out soil characterization into intensive and extensive properties. And the pH, if you take 10 samples and mix them together, and I don't know about the pulverizing. I tell them never pulverize my sample. I'll do that, and then I know what they're measuring on. But you can mix them. You can get nutrients. You can get pH. You can get salts. Those are intensive properties as long as that soil was mixed right. But extensive properties are infiltration, which doesn't just depend on texture, sand, silt, and clay, but it depends on the structure that we talked about. I find that nitrogen levels are very much an extensive property, because the labs will test nitrate and ammonium, the soluble part, in one little bitty part of the soil, but the real thing that drives nitrogen and organic matter are litter layers on the top and wads of compost down here and old roots and a whole bunch of stuff that you don't see on a little square of soil. So pretty much I use those soil tests for intensive things, all the things that might constrain plant growth, but I don't use them at all for things that will increase plant growth, which is water availability and nitrogen cycling. Now, having said that, either, well, those are the main things that drive my sites, and that's very true. I'll get a kind of uniform, well-sampled, well-mixed, representative set of samples, and I'll send them off to the lab. I'll know pH, EC, NPK, all that kind of stuff. But then I say, okay, nothing looks like it's really going to kill this site like pH 11. On the other hand, I don't know what's really going to grow this site, and that's where I have to get back to the organics, the profile, the soil structure of a whole rooting zone, not just a little cube of soil. So that's the way I split it out, and the only caveat is I don't have the short-term horticultural deliverables that you all have. So I got a bigger performance window.
On the other hand, I never go back to my sites. So, I mean, I go back, but we can't amend them anymore. And they grow. I mean, we've had coyote bush grow on barren ground to shoulder high in a year and a half. Once we fix it, their plants are really willing to do this. I'm not saying they don't grow, but if it's a dry year, these are tough rocks, it's a dry year, we'll come back next year. And I know you all can't do that on your jobs.
Do you have recommendation for how many samples you
Well, don't ask the statistical reason for that, because the sample N number comes like 64 or 180. It's nuts. So what we do is we'll do 4. That way, if you have a real bogus one sample, you had 3 to give you a mean. Now I know that's just don't she'll report me and get me disqualified from university work. But the fact of the matter is, when we've looked at the statistics, you really can't afford to sample that much because soils are so variable. Same way with compost.
But you can sample a little bit more and then mix them up.
So that's
So
what
you
we
have
do. We'll sample a
sub-samples.
bunch and composite them together and kind of wash that out and still do 3.
So
or
if you
4.
have 4 groups of subsamples in the same, then I'm more comfortable with that.
From a contractor's perspective on how many samples, the quality where you're going to get is going to be based on the quality of the contractor, because you don't really know what they do. And so much of soil prep, from my perspective, is the quality of your contractor. And, can you trust them? And I can tell you from a contractor's perspective, seeing projects when we weren't low bid and didn't get them, and I go by and watch, and I see the dusting of compost that happens before soil prep, and they didn't bring the landscape architect on for CA, and you look at the plant health over the long term, and they got what they paid for. So, from an architect standpoint, I think a huge lever point for you is the quality contractor. How do you vet them through the process and not be stuck with a low bid guy that left something out that's cutting corners on soil prep, because that's going to be the biggest impact to your project that it's so hard to hold them accountable for. So the easy solution to hold them accountable is right in your specs, you're going to ask for receipts for amendments, right? You probably never thought you'd hear a contractor tell you this. Do it, because it's what makes the level playing field for a quality contractor. It forces the competition to do that. And it's not very hard for you to manage that. You think of all the CA work you have to do, it's not very hard to require them to do that and force them to submit those receipts. And that's what's going to ensure the quality in your soil.
Just really quickly on the samples again. It totally depends on how big of an area you're looking at and how homogeneous that area is. And so even if you have no training in soils or ecology or whatever, you can just take a walk around and look, is there a really swampy area? Does it look like something was growing different here? Is it pretty hilly? And then you should use those kind of variations on the landscape that you're working on to drive your sampling strategy. So then you might not, if you're strategic about it, you don't need as many, but be strategic about it.
Can I ask one question? You talked about this about what we want when you send a sample to the lab. I guess the big question there is, I've been specifying the soil for many times and not really comfortable with what I'm specifying. How do you know how do we know what I want is right? And there are many different types of plants. Grass, native grass, or native trees and normal trees, or they're all different plants. And how do we know what I want is right?
Do you mean specific to a plant?
Well, I guess there's two different questions, I guess. How do I know what is good for the plant, for survival, for their giving what trees and the plants you want?
Well, okay. I'm going to pass it back to you guys.
So that's one soil for the project that you're concerned that you want to support trees and shrubs and grasses.
Usually for the projects, just have one
one soil type, right? And then what's the other part of the question?
Well, I guess the second part is that will there be, will different type of trees and plants will be, can survive even though with one homogeneous?
Right, like an average type soil. So it sounds like it's, you know, how do you, I guess part of that's going to depend on the plant selection, but, you know, is there sort of an ideal soil for some particular situation? And it seems like part of that's going to be based on testing what you have to start with. But
I'm just like you hire a horticulturalist to help you with your plant selection, get a soil scientist on board on your team, and you can work with them on determining what's going to be the best blend. And I would, and in working with, you know, your arborist, your horticulturalist, the different types of plants that you're dealing with, and they're going to give you the basic range. I mean, you know, there's a slight variation in the pH for different species, but that can probably be just topically applied if you have a good solid base. If you have a good Class A topsoil that you can be planting in with the organic. That's the neat thing about plants. They all have an inherent desire to live. They all want to succeed. And it's just when you give them the wrong conditions is when, you know, if they don't have the drainage, if it's over compacted, that's when you start to see the problem.